Hi, everyone. This is Peter Hans, and welcome to Between Two Chains. This is Season 2, Episode 3, recorded on September 1st. My guest is Jeremy Parris from Delphi Ventures, and he really focuses on the NFT gaming metaverse space and more into also the social aspect of Web3. Frankly, it was probably one of the conversations that I learned the most on in the past 2 years of doing Between Two Chains. He just is a absolute wealth of knowledge, not only on Web3 and I think the possibilities of where we're going, but also very astute in terms of where we are right now and a lot of the hurdles that we need to overcome in the way traditional gaming companies and traditional Web2 companies are thinking about the future and how we're going to advance. We get into a lot of different buzzwords and why they matter or don't matter, such as decentralization versus centralization, and the fact that there is room for both, and it's not black or white. We get into staking and why, in many cases, that just doesn't make sense, which to me was really refreshing to hear. So I really hope you enjoy the episode. Please rate, review, subscribe, and remember this commentary is not intended to be investment advice, investment research, or recommendation. Please consult your investment professional for your own circumstances. Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. This is Hans, and welcome to Between Two Chains. This week, I've got a really exciting guest, Jeremy Parris from Delphi Digital, who focuses on the blockchain gaming space, which is something that I know a lot of investors have interest in as, one of the real kind of identified early use cases of, commercial implementation of NFTs and really, I think, digging into where we are in the timeline and kind of what the potential is more so than potentially where we are now, though I think that also is important. So Jeremy, I'm really excited to have you on. Thanks for joining, and I would love to hear maybe a little bit about just Delphi briefly, kind of what you do there and what Delphi does, and then a little bit on your background in this space.
Absolutely. First of all, absolute pleasure to be discussing these things with you today on the podcast. And yeah, a little bit of background on myself at Delphi. At a high level, Delphi Digital, we have three different arms to Delphi. We have our ventures arm, our research arm, and our labs arm. All pretty self-explanatory there. Basically, labs is just where we help build things. Ventures, we do venture stuff, and research, deep institutional and grade research. Sort of the Bloomberg of crypto, if you will, to a certain extent. I'm one of our ventures associates over at Delphi, and I, as you mentioned, focus specifically on Web3 blockchain gaming, NFTs, metaverse, and more recently, been really drilling into the social side of things with soulbound tokens and other types of social tokens as opposed to financial tokens. And yeah, background on myself is, and what I do at Delphi is besides the venture side of things, try to focus and roll up my sleeves on actual token design, game loops and games economies and different kinds of economies. So get to help make all the models and magic happen behind the scenes. It's a super fun and diverse job for sure. Never two problems are the same. So would rather be doing nothing else.
And so there's a lot there, and I've got like a million questions that I want to explore, frankly, because it's something that I think is very interesting. So I think the concept. Let's just start with gaming, because I think that is probably people are probably the most familiar with the application of play to earn of kind of how an NFT ecosystem could fit into gaming. Now, I would say, like from my standpoint, adoption has not been huge yet, but I think frankly that's to be expected. But as I see it, I think you look at evolution of gaming, right? Especially with I guess higher higher upload and download speeds. It was very hard to have mobile gaming or internet-based gaming when you had dial-up, right? Obviously impossible pre-internet, and now that you can actually stream, I think the face of gaming has changed a lot versus when I was a kid, right? So, but and it seems to me like the dynamics of many games right now is, yeah, you can sell the unit, whether you download it or you buy the physical copy, and then there's like basically marketplaces on the games where you're purchasing additional assets or things like that, and play online and so on and so forth. The NFT component of gaming to me represents essentially shifting the model from where the NBA 2K or EA Sports directly selling coins that you can use as an in-game currency to purchase stuff, or Fortnite or what have you. Instead, it would be players exchanging those unique assets within the game, and the gaming company earning a transaction fee on the exchange. Like, does that essentially sum up like one of the I think major use cases? And the benefit there being like the issuer of the game still makes money, and potentially
Yeah.
much more based on transaction volume, but the player in the game actually has an economic incentive more so than just a pure collecting and playing incentive,
Yeah.
increasing basically the switching costs, right? Making the switching costs higher.
Yes. So a lot to unpack there, but great starting point. So I kind of want to frame these things briefly in imagining both now and 5 years in the future, right? And then we'll kind of dive into some of your questions. I think what Web3 offers, specifically game designers, game economists, and development teams itself, are new models, but I would look at it more as new tools to do new things and create new models inside of the gaming space. And when we look back in 5 years' time, I think this will just be the evolution of gaming, because the history of gaming, a chapter in that book, to some extent will be, shifting from Web 2 to Web 3, just like we shifted from the arcade to home consoles, and from home consoles to mobile devices, and from, as you mentioned, download and upload speeds. So
Mm-hmm.
this to me is an evolution and an expansion of the toolbox for designers and economists. On the player side of things, it does also represent a shift of the ownership layer, absolutely, for sure. And I think that's where a lot of the friction, misunderstandings, and a lot of the confusion begins to occur, because there's so many different ways to own and profit, and so many different models for Web3 gaming at the moment. And we'll just say it's Web3 gaming at the moment, and Web2 and Web3 haven't quite converged yet.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the NFT ownership layer, there's the token ownership layer itself, like the fungible token side of things. So with like Axie, it would be AXS and SLP.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's no right or wrong model when it comes to a game model. I think once again they're all different tools for different specific purposes. But with NFTs, we've seen it come in many forms. Like with Top Shot, we saw it as trading cards, which makes sense, right? I mean, we're all familiar and comfortable with trading cards. With Axie, we're owning our digital pets. Like, how cool would it be to own your Pokemon back in the day, and have that switching cost available? But that switching cost has always been there to some extent. It's what we did as kids at GameStop, right? Or in exchanging our old discs for new discs and
Sure.
getting a bit of a buyback. So I think it represents some of that in a digital realm. But one thing I think that we do focus on in Web3 gaming, and this area specifically, is sort of the financial side of things. And I think sometimes the financial things can disrupt the gameplay and the game side of things.
Yep.
Now, what I mean by that, it's like, and I'm gonna give probably a really bad example, but like imagine the game of soccer or football, depending on what side of the ocean you're on, right? And we wanted to completely revolutionize that game. The reason we play soccer, or the reason we play sports, or the reason we play games now, largely is for fun and for the magic and for the flow state and for all these things, right? The way you make money off of soccer or a lot of games isn't by picking up a soccer ball and like kicking it against a wall and getting 1 cent for every time you kick a soccer ball. You make money in soccer further down the line when you get a college degree, when you get scouted by the MLB. Like the financialization of soccer and a lot of games currently isn't just by playing. So I think that framing is interesting when looking at how we build models into games that are less financially focused and more fun focused, player focused, more game focused, if that makes sense.
It does, and I actually think that. So I think there's been a number of narratives, as there is, look, with any
Of
new
course.
innovation, people try to figure out what box it fits in. And I remember,
Mm-hmm.
with Axie in particular, right? There was, constantly this narrative about like, well, all these, people in the Philippines are making a living, playing Axie all day. And I'm like, well, is that really the goal? Or is this at the end of the day like a video game that is supposed to be fun and entertaining and you do it because it's a fun game to play, not to earn a living. Now there are like anything, and if you compare it to a sport, and I guess there is such thing as esports, right? Yeah, maybe the top like 1% of 1% like can literally make a living playing video games, but not because of you know they breed axes and sell them to someone for like eventually that has to run out, right? The game has to stand on its own legs, and so I didn't mean to imply because I don't believe in that narrative per se. Like I
No,
didn't
no,
mean
yeah.
to imply that you play the
No, no.
games for financial benefit, but I do think that, and you see this now. Like I went through a like now that I have a um, my my oldest daughter is not so much into it, but I have a 10-year-old son, right? And I showed him like I had an old Wii and they got into that. And then I'm like, someone gave me a Switch and I have NBA 2K and he's into basketball. I showed him that. And he was onto that. And I was like looking at it and playing around with it. I'm like, oh my God, there's like these exchanges and like you
Yeah.
can take your player card and like auction it off and use that to buy someone else. I'm like, this is an exchange. Like this
Yep.
is the only difference is it's just not NFT. There's no blockchain component, which you could argue like maybe you need that, maybe you don't. But to me, the benefit of tokenizing any asset is the like exchangeability or interoperability of it, right? So
Yeah.
especially, and I know Sasha's talked about like moving things game to game. So like if I've gone and like, because now I'm like, oh, this is cool. So I'm playing around with it. I'm collecting like all the old 90s Knicks and stuff and building a team like that. And but if I could build up a Patrick Ewing and then sell it,
Right.
like, yeah, I could use that in game. But if I stop playing the game as a person, it would be really cool if I could go use that, and I guess that's where an AXS or an comes into play. That's then exchangeable on Coinbase for something else. Or if we're looking 10 years down the road, I can exchange it for you know, Starbucks reward points or something like that, where like every asset is interchangeable even within games? Or am I like a little bit in fantasy land?
No, well, I think we're all in Fantasyland
Well, that's
to a
fair.
certain extent, you know what I mean? Um, no, I think you're touching upon a ton of super interesting things there, but I also think like you mentioned a few different examples there, and I would argue that each one of those different examples is like a different model and a different use case, and that's where maybe some of the confusion happens, is like where we start mixing use cases and models. So
Hmm.
just some of the ones that you mentioned, like Axie, for example, and 2K. So you're looking at like play to earn, and if 2K was brought into a Web3 sort of sense, you're looking at probably like a decentralized open ecosystem. Let's call it the 2K token, but you're probably looking at a centralized closed ecosystem in the marketplace and in the game itself, right? So you might use your 2K token and swap that into like the sports currency so you could begin playing within that sports ecosystem. But we'll put that to the side and come back to that and unpack it later. Like that's one model and
Hmm.
ecosystem as compared to Axie. You're looking at a two token economy where SLP is theoretically this utility token that you could earn with, and in the early days that made a lot of sense, but I think a lot of people don't realize that in the early days of Axie as well, or Axie still is like a half built game.
Yeah.
It would be like if we were talking about Pokemon and we only had like the battle system and we were missing the entire open world, and we're like, this game isn't fun. Well, it's like, well, it's a half built game, but that's still an alpha technically. But getting back to the point, different models, different things. Like Axie is a certain model, 2K is a certain model, and then you might have a model that just has NFTs and no token at all. And there's a lot of models that could happen with that as well, where you come in as a player, you maybe get that Patrick Ewing as a rookie, and you have to build him up. Like, what makes that Patrick Ewing valuable? It's the provenance, right?
Hmm.
If 100 knights start off with 100 swords in a medieval game, which one becomes King Arthur and which one becomes Excalibur, right? It's the provenance, it's the questing that you put into that NFT to make it valuable over time. In a more open market system, or like an open marketplace system like in Axie, I think that provenance is a little bit tougher because it's a lot easier for things to be exchanged. Things are more focused on scarcity and rarity, as opposed to provenance and sort of like an NFT's path and what has been put into that NFT. What is the legend of that NFT, right?
Hmm.
With something like a more closed ecosystem where you might have like a digital currency, which we're all very familiar with, like grandma who plays Candy Crush is actually super native with digital currencies. Gold and gems are digital currencies to an
Hmm.
extent. It's just in a closed ecosystem that's centralized. That isn't necessarily a bad model in a lot of circumstances. And I think that's something we will see for sure come into Web3 gaming because it's a game economy and ecosystem, right? But it's just then how do people interact with that in a more Web3 way? Like, and that's a big question.
Yeah.
Um,
So can I interject because this
oh, yeah.
is yeah this is really interesting to me. So to me, and taking a step back, so basically we went um, you know you know Web one very static, reading an article online, right? Web two more interactive, but the value accrues to the issuer, right? The creator, like there's no value as the consumer, even though they need the consumer to create value. Web three, the entire thesis, as I would describe it, is basically like uh, the value starts to accrue to the user, right? To and whatever it is, it could be from social to gaming, right? Whatever it is, the value accrues there. Um, the the concept of different models within gaming, that might be something like I haven't really considered too much because and when I think about gaming, and you bring up an interesting point even going farther back of like the arcades to the home console, right? Like it was more of just the entire ecosystem transitioned and grew up. I mean, yeah, you still have arcades and stuff like that, but for the most
Yeah.
part, to mobile, right? But what I think you're kind of getting up here is like, is play to earn is actually a different model than like Fortnite, right? Has a digital currency within the closed ecosystem, but it's
Right.
not, you can't exit that ecosystem as a player. Like if I play Fortnite for 2 years, spend all this money, build up all this stuff, there's no way for me to recoup any of that by
Right.
selling it, unless I do it
Yeah.
like whatever through Craigslist or
Sure.
something.
Gray markets, black markets, all that
Yeah,
good stuff.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, like, do you foresee gaming companies changing their philosophies over time? Because and one reason might be they know this stuff's happening on black or
Yep.
gray markets, right? And
Yep.
if they can just build the exchange, then they can capture some of that value.
Absolutely. So, 100% is the short answer.
Okay.
Yes. And I guess with everything we just talked about, the punchline and the TLDR there and the high level is it'll happen in a bunch of different ways, right?
Yep.
Because of there is different models. So to answer your question more pointedly, like how could a game company and a player make money out of these new models, or what types of ownership or revenue can these new models generate from a games company or studio point of view, putting aside like what model it is? As you mentioned earlier, that could be through transactional volume, that could be by giving games and assets away for free and then building a ton of utility into them and then just putting a 10% secondary market fee on it and then collecting that secondary market fee. We've seen that happen in the last week, depending on when this airs, with Digidaiku, Gabe Linden's new thing, free to own, and that new thing that's kicking off.
Hmm.
Not going to comment on that in particular, but that is a way that a company could earn off of a Web3 model, right? Now, one thing though that I think is worth saying is and what I was trying to get at earlier, it's like it doesn't have to be exclusively Web3, right? You could have traditional monetization methods in there. Like
Oh, of course. Yeah.
you could still charge $60 for a game, and maybe that game comes with like a couple NFTs to get you started, and then the switching cost is when you're finished with that game, you have an NFT that you've built up, and you trade that NFT on a secondary market, just like you used to go into a game store and trade an NFT with, or maybe who knows, you're selling assets along the way like you used to do in World of Warcraft. Um, yeah, like there's a bunch of different ways. And same thing with the players. Depending on the type of game they're playing, they might be earning the token, the fluid liquid token, from grinding, from playing, from achievement and quest lines, from completing the game, and then they could sell that token on the secondary market, or maybe use that token to power up NFTs that make them more valuable, and they could trade those on the secondary market. Lots of different ways that we could see this begin to occur. But to your point, and from what I see behind the scenes, absolutely every single gaming studio and company, well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of them are very seriously looking at how to get into this, but to do it in a safe way. I think we'll see it happen slowly and then all at once. Right now, a lot of companies are just exploring what and how, and how to kind of tackle that. So it's coming around the corner. And it'll be interesting to see how it exactly materializes.
So let me ask a couple of questions about, kind of the gaming company's mentality behind the scenes, and
Mm-hmm.
I guess maybe this pertains to more traditional gaming companies, but
Mm-hmm.
usually companies evolve, right? Either for one of two reasons: either because you think it's a better mousetrap and you're going to make more money, or because you know that this is the future, and if you don't advance, you'll die. So do you think gaming companies lean more towards which one?
That's actually a great question. So this is something I actually contemplate a lot, because think about like Atari and Sega. Like those guys
Hmm.
kind of they're still around, but those guys used to be the Microsofts and the Epics and the Apples of
Hmm.
yesterday, right? And we've seen EA and Ubisoft and some of these larger companies not die but downtrend. Maybe Blizzard's the best example there. Blizzard's been really taking a nosedive recently for a lot of different reasons. So I think a lot of companies are looking at this space right now and absolutely looking at it for those reasons. Like we better adapt and adopt or potentially die,
Hmm.
right? Whether or not they're able to do that, I think some might, some will, some won't. That boils down to a bunch of different questions, like is there a point in a company's lifespan where they do become too big or calcified or stuck in their models and ways to transition and pivot? I don't know. Will the people at the game companies be able to execute and wrap their heads around this weird Web3 stuff? I don't know. Or will there be a whole new wave that emerges? I think there will be a new wave that emerges, but not in the ways we think. And what I mean by that, I'll give a quick example, and I think it'll highlight it. From my point of view, wearing my VC hat, I see a lot of pitches of like we're going to be the next Steam or the next Twitch of Web3.
Hmm.
But if you were to ask a lot of those people who are trying to create the next Steam of Web3, it's like, dude, do you know how Steam got started or how Epic or Unreal got started? Oftentimes it wasn't because they were trying to build that thing necessarily. It kind of happened by accident. Like a lot of people might not realize or remember that Steam used to be Valve. And how did Valve turn into Steam? And why doesn't Valve make games anymore? Valve never set out to be the Steam of Web 2. And so I think the quote unquote Steam or the next publishing or studio of Web 3 or of gaming in this next iteration will look something completely different. However, with our skeuomorphic way of thinking, when we go from Web 2 to Web 3, we try to pick the lowest hanging fruit and the things that make sense to the way we've hardwired our brains, which is another reason why I think NFTs this last couple years has really taken off, because NFTs in the Web3 space are probably the easiest thing to understand. And it's probably why we saw Top Shot really take off, because in Web 2, once again, going back to skeuomorphism, we understand collectible cards because that already exists. We understand land is valuable because in the real world, land's already super valuable. So why wouldn't it be valuable in Web3? Like those are huge conversations in Web3 because like let's maybe not go down the land rabbit hole, but the point is it's like valuable land and scarcity and reputation in Web3 is probably going to be a little bit different than what we're used to in Web2. That was a big ramble.
No, I think I get where you're going. And it almost seems like, look, I think there are certain types of like companies or business models in Web 2 where and I'm mostly talking like social and behavioral data, where like a Web3 component or even full on transition like makes sense economically, like morally, legally, like so many things. And there's somewhere like it's pretty transparent anyway, especially when you're talking about like gaming from a Web 2 standpoint, right? So like, do we? Is there a need to transition all the way to Web 3? Can we do like a Web 2.5? Can there be some Web 3, some Web 2? And it seems like
Absolutely.
you're kind of saying, yeah, like they're going to be different models.
Absolutely. Um, and I think like to boil maybe yeah I don't know if this is high level or boiling it down or psychological whatever,
Hmm.
but I think a lot of times when we look at Web 2 versus Web 3 and what is Web 2.5, like that's us thinking about this technology today and kind of like putting this like tribal and team lens on it because maybe some Web 2 people or gamers are freaked out by Web 3, and I'm not making any judgments or assumptions
Sure.
here, but maybe because like they don't understand it, or maybe it threatens their job or their career or their way of thinking, right? Web 3, I think sometimes we have ego and like big heads thinking like we're revolutionaries and we're doing whatever kind of great work and we're going to change the world, which hopefully we do. But let's once again, 5, 10 years down the line, like I think there's a lot more blending than 2 or 3, right? It's just, once again, new tools, new technology, new ways to do things and build things in a way that makes sense, you know? And I think this is why in the past and in history, sometimes we like jokingly point to like how people reacted to bicycles, you know, and what people used to say about bicycles, like, and how dangerous
That
they
I'm not
were.
familiar with.
Oh, I mean, there's a bunch. Or like, remember, like,
Yeah.
I mean, think about like how our parents reacted to cell phones, or how we're watching our
Sure.
kids
Sure.
adopt
Sure.
cell phones, or
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
video games. Like, video games are gonna turn everybody into violent murderers, or
Mhm.
electricity. Like people thought, or reading.
Yeah.
I heard a
I mean,
great
it's
one.
any
Yeah,
innovation. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
I think we're just going through that weird, violent, confused, transitionary phase right now because it
Well, yeah,
is
it threatens the status quo.
exactly.
Or it potentially does, and that's when you see. I mean, it's maybe a good transition for like various narratives that like and you see all the time, XYZ company announces that they're going to launch an NFT, and then like community backlash over the environmental impact, and
Yeah,
they're pulling back, which to me is
yeah,
just kind of like, it's just so obvious. It's like it's akin to like Coke and Pepsi launching the high carb diets, low fat diets of the 90s that just made Americans fat.
yeah, yeah.
So but it does seem like some of that stuff is dissipating, and especially as you get like more energy efficient chains and better transaction values. That said, I think there's still a lot to figure out. You see side chains and security risks and hacks. Like we still probably have a long ways to go from a security standpoint and
Huge.
scammer standpoint. I mean, even like what happened with Axie, right?
Yeah.
And there's side chain hacks all the time.
Yep. Absolutely. Or just your wallet getting hacked or
Yep.
your own security getting compromised. But I was listening to Mark Andreessen chat the other day. I forget if it was to like Joe Rogan or if it was Sam Harris. I want to say it was Sam
He had a
Harris.
Sam
Great pod.
Harris
Yeah,
call. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, great chat. And he was saying, man, we were talking about the same things back in the early days of the internet when it came
for
to
sure,
email. Same
for
exact
sure.
security things. And that's where it's just like I don't know, maybe that's where like the political angle just like supercharges people and freaks people out, but it's like with the amount of money and just smart people, frankly, that are thinking about this stuff, it's like we will sort that out. There's just
Mhm.
too much money and too much big brains thinking about and working on all of these specific problems that people bring up, that I think will solve them. And that's not just like hand wavy, sort of like, kind of how we wave our hand at environmental issues, but I see the innovation every single day, from where I sit in the ecosystem. And I guess that's what inspires me personally. But yeah, no, I think it's coming.
But I think it also, yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff are, and that's a great point about Andreessen's comments on like early days of the internet. It's sort of the exact same thing, right? And I mean, even like one thing I always bring up with, people I talk to aren't, as familiar with just kind of, blockchain ecosystem in general is just like, look, and they're worried about like regulatory angles or political angles. I'm like, back in the, I guess it was probably like, 80s, like maybe, I don't remember exactly what the date was, but like the internet was illegal to use for commerce. Like it was
Yeah.
viewed as something solely for research institutions to, there was no internet. So you actually had to regulate the internet so that it could be used for commerce. And I think we're still like, we're so early in kind of this, um, the various use cases, and we do. I think regulation. People are probably sick of me talking about this, but I do think regulation will serve as a really good springboard for, like it'll set ground rules. Like you're not going to see
Yeah.
EA Sports and like Activisions and Blizzards
Oh
like
yeah.
get involved until they know what the rules are, right? And just like you don't see big investors get involved until they know what the rules are. Um,
To that point, from like a designer point of view, and I don't want to get like too much into the legal side of things, but as like a somebody who like tries to make designs with these things and build economies out of them, I look forward to that as well. So I know where the boundaries are, because sometimes I'm playing with this really cool idea or design, and then like halfway through my daydreaming, I'm like, oh, security.
yep.
Obvious security. But it's like, man, it's such a cool design. Now, God bless some of the people in Web3 who've just done that anyways, and done really cool designs and really cool things with it, whether or not, the hammer gets brought down or what happens with that.
For sure.
We're seeing new innovation. We're seeing new ideas. And I think that's what's so exciting about it, man. It's,
Mhm.
it keeps us up at night. Like this is a whole new way to do something, and there's like this sense of excitement where sometimes like I'll have an idea, maybe it's about a token design or just like peeling back an extra layer of the onion, and there's this moment, and I say this like super humbly with no ego, where it's like maybe this is a novel idea, maybe nobody
Right.
has ever thought about this before. What can we do with this?
Mhm.
Like, how is this going to change things? And like that's really exciting. And but back to the point about securities and laws and that sort of thing, I can't wait till we have more clarity on all of that and a lot less gray area, so we could really tighten up some designs, and so we could really tighten up some models and make sure these things are airtight, because it protects the companies, it protects us, and at the end it protects the user and the player, right? Like you don't want to rug your player because you had a bad design and it ended up being a security, and maybe they're now somehow liable and responsible for it too. That's an absolutely valid criticism that a lot of Web 2 gamers, companies, etc., throw at Web 3. And I think we try to defend against that too often rather than like think about that and take it in stride,
Yeah,
right?
100%. And I think because this is such a young um, space, right? Which is great. Like it's one of the beauties of it. And there's so many like young people excited about innovating in the future. Like people like me are, I went from being young in TradFi to being like a really old man in digital assets, which is cool. I'll take it. But but I think what like people who are just so like emotionally invested in something, you see it on Twitter, and this is why like Twitter's so toxic. It's just like fight, 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 butt heads. Like you don't
Bro.
convince anyone that way. Like if the bottom line is if like going after this market and like want all this innovation in gaming companies, like you have to listen to the actual concerns and like, okay, how can we address these concerns instead of just arguing and denying them, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like really impressed, frankly, to hear like, you acknowledge that and say that, because you can always point out like why someone is wrong, but you're certainly not going to convince that person that they think they're wrong. They're just going to fight back harder.
Dude,
So yeah.
one of the biggest learning moments we had internally at Delphi, and we published a report that's open to the public on this. That's sort of our new, I wouldn't call it thesis, but like detailed thoughts on gaming. Like what spurred a lot of that was a guy named Brooks Brown who is working on this game called Nor, who's just a genius. But B was by looking at all of the criticism that was
Mhm.
coming from traditional gamers about NFTs and gaming and like talking to game developers and like hearing those things out, and then like taking a step back as a team and going like, crap, they're all super valid. And then we had to go back to the drawing board and then think about all the old designs. If you want to be super cheesy about it, you had to be the Phoenix. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. No,
but
absolutely.
but we had to, and because of that, we're way deeper in our thinking now by acknowledging that and not calcifying. Super important. Um, I I don't want to change subject or pivot here, but there
You run the show. It's perfect.
no.
Go ahead.
Well, like just like being mindful of like some listeners or some audience, or just your audience potentially.
Yeah.
I think maybe it could be kind of fun and interesting to run through like maybe some of the buzzwords or hype words that are floating around Web3, gaming, NFTs, and maybe unpack them or talk about
Yeah.
them a little bit.
I that's actually kind of like where one of the places I definitely wanted to go. And the other thing too that I do want to make sure I touch on, and I'll just say it now. We don't have to do it right now, but is like, the whole concept of Web3 and decentralization and like I've come to believe, and I think the more I think about it, the more I believe it, that there's like
Yeah.
magnitudes of decentralization, right? Like the whole argument of like, well, and I think part of this stems from like the origination of blockchain and the concept behind it and the concept behind Bitcoin, and like that's great, but it's not, but not everything needs to be fully decentralized. And in fact, there are, I would argue, as a end user of a product or an ecosystem, like sometimes there are large advantages to having a centralized entity behind you, as long as there's trust there. And if there's not trust there, then you probably shouldn't be involved in the first place. But
100%.
that, I mean, and maybe decentralization is one of those buzzwords, and it
I think
sounds
so.
like in gaming, like it doesn't have to be fully decentralized, right? And in fact,
No.
it's I would argue it's basically where we are right now with security and everything. Like it's almost better to not. I mean, look at Axie, right? If you were an Axie player and you got, when they got hacked and you potentially lost a lot of money in say ETH terms, right? The fact that there was Andreessen and centralized entities behind that could come in and basically plug that hole or make that right, is a huge advantage, because otherwise
Yeah.
there would be no more Axie.
No, dude. I think maybe the decentralized centralized one is a good one to start with, because I do think that yes, absolutely, you're right. Oftentimes and largely, it is a buzzword, and sometimes we focus on it too much. And sometimes it does need to be enforced strictly. But once again, centralized, being centralized or decentralized, I would once again argue is a tool that needs to be used correctly depending on what you're building,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't just copy and paste other models or other things. You have to build it from the ground up, I would argue. Now, maybe like I'll just give a quick example of like where like centralization could be good in a game and where decentralization could be good in a game or in these
Yeah,
different
that
economies
that'd
and
be great.
environments. So like decentralization, like you mentioned, like you want some tokens to be decentralized. Like you want AXS to be decentralized, or you want certain tokens to be decentralized for people to speculate on, for people to play financial games with. Now, or
What do you
okay,
mean by
that's
that?
yeah. I was about to say that wasn't the right phrase. when I
That
when I
because
say
yeah, 'cause-
yeah, maybe not financial games, but let me put it this way: the person who stakes AXS and the player of Axie are probably playing two different games, right?
Okay.
The speculator or the market player, let's call them, is playing a certain kind of metagame around the game of Axie, and the player is playing the game of Axie, let's call it. Now, what I mean by metagame is that like Axie itself produces meta or data or info, if you're not as familiar with the term. It creates rich meta data, info, markets around the game, and that produces an environment where a market player could play. That might be the guy who stakes AXS and gets yield and derivatives and plays like the DeFi angle, while you have a scholar inside of the game of Axie playing for like different reasons. They're playing maybe for fun, and some cases they do play for fun. Other cases they're playing to make money, depending on what time period we're talking about. You have different guilds playing a different kind of game inside of the ecosystem of Axie, let's call it. They're not playing the game itself. They're managing sort of like a middle layer, right? They're providing the sort of guild layer in this weird decentralized tech stack, right?
All right. Let me stop there for a second because I want to make sure I understand. Okay, so when you're talking about, so as I would think about a game, like
Mm-hmm.
playing a game, like
Mm-hmm.
Axie, I would think the people who are playing the game are literally the ones who go in and pick up the controller or the keyboard and
Yeah.
actually play the game.
Yeah.
You're when you talk about, the Axie token holder, like I think, Arca invested in Axie in one
Mm-hmm.
of the funds, right? Like, and could stake it and earn a yield on it and so on and so forth, right? I wouldn't view Arca, I would view Arca as a financial investor in the growth of the ecosystem, but
Right.
not a player in the game. But it sounds like to me you're saying that this is a model where you don't have to actually play the video game to play the game because there's a financial game within to be
Maybe
played.
so. Two points to make there. You guys aren't technically, or sorry, when I say you guys, I mean like the let's call it the financier, the degen, maybe or maybe not the VC, but the financial player. First of all, when I say like player, I don't mean that in any sort of like sinister, shady terms.
No, no,
Like,
no. I'm certainly not implying
no,
that.
no. I don't mean to clarify that for you. It's just I know that might sound a bit like, people are pulling the strings, and depending on how you think about VCs, because I encounter this all the time from the Delphi point of
I
view.
mean,
You know
yeah. I
what I
mean, I think
mean?
that's a narrative.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. So, but I guess what I mean is like, no, we aren't necessarily playing the game of Axie, but imagine, okay, let me put it like this and see if it kind of hits. Once again, going back to the game of soccer, the club owner or the Saudi prince who's investing in Manchester isn't playing the same game of soccer, but he is engaging in the ecosystem of soccer, right? He is playing a different meta game in the realm of soccer, right? Soccer, the game itself, produces rich enough meta because of the players, because of Ronaldo, because of Manchester and these leagues, and sort of the richness that these things actually create, that create different sort of,
Well, they're the owners of the club, right? So they would they would be analogous to the game issuer, right? As opposed to a different kind of player, right? Right? So like I don't know. I mean, if you looked at it this way, it was like take poker, right?
mm-hmm,
At a casino, right? Like so you have the people who go into the casino and play poker, right? And
yeah,
they make and lose money and they actually play the game of poker. You
yeah,
have the house, right,
mm-hmm,
which provides the venue for the ecosystem and collects a revenue stream based on the pot every time. So they collect. And then you have, if you want to go to the guild relationship, you have people who sit behind and finance really good poker players to be able to enter tournaments and take a cut of their winnings and so on and so forth, right? But I wouldn't look at, I mean, the players are obviously playing. The guild or the financier, to an extent, maybe you could argue that. And then the casino, like they're more of like the Web 2 version of it, but I guess providing a Web 3. It's hard because we're talking about like in real life versus.
yeah.
But I think I
May,
get what you're saying.
maybe
It's just a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, maybe my framing was poor. Maybe the like let's not say like playing in a game or playing the game, but interacting in the ecosystem which the game produces. And there's different layers of which you can interact within that ecosystem. And each one of those layers probably have different people doing different things and interacting with that. I don't know if I want to call it product. Let's call it the game in different ways.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
like the house, the financier, the soccer club owner, the manager, the footballer, the gambler. They're all within those respective ecosystems. And at the heart of those ecosystems would be the game of poker. And within the
hmm
other one is the game of soccer, the game of
sure.
Axie. And then you have multiple different layers within that ecosystem in which people interact with it. Now, going back to the original question of centralization versus decentralization, in some of those layers, decentralization might be super important, and in other layers, centralization might be super important, right? Depending on what we're talking about exactly. I hope that doesn't like go too into the abstract or into the strangeness, or maybe provides a different kind of framing.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's a lot to think about and kind of like different paths you can go down, and frankly, that may or may not be even like relevant
Mm.
to kind of like what ultimately I think we're getting at. But maybe let me go back to the economic participation in the gaming ecosystem, right? So we'll
Mm-hmm.
just take Axie as an example, right? Like if you know, thinking about it in a simplistic way, if you if one thinks that okay, Axie is this amazing game, totally revolutionary, I think this is going to be huge in the future. How do I get exposure to this, right? You would do that by buying the Axie token, right? And you can just hold that and be a passive investor in that, or you can um, participate without playing the game more directly in the ecosystem by, you know, staking and things of that nature, which is just I guess like almost like a different type of game. I mean, maybe it's the equivalent like because I think of it like sports games. Maybe it's the equivalent of like you can play Madden and be like the players, or you can put it in like GM mode and just like make choices and move things around, but not
Right.
actually play the game. Um, so I don't know if that's a decent analogy, but I don't think those investors would necessarily. Maybe the more involved they are, they look at themselves as playing in the game. But okay, explain to me because I'm still like, frankly, you know, trying to wrap my head around like I why staking matters. So if I'm an Axie token holder, right, and I stake it to earn a yield, like why does anyone care about staking Axie other than there's just less in circulation? Like what actual value does it provide?
Okay, man, I love this question. Okay, let's not use Axie as an example here,
Okay.
just so we don't go like down a bunch of weird rabbit holes. But let's just like take that question in a broader sense,
Yeah, please,
like
please.
why does staking matter? Man, I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but I think staking's stupid in like 95% of cases. And
Okay.
frankly, I think staking in most cases is just giving a token utility because it's the only utility you can give it because you probably launched it too early or you launched it without having utility already there or you got strong armed by your investors on unlock and locking terms or you were too far away from your project. And so now you have this token out in the wild and you actually don't have any tech or anything other than like community art contests and you go, what can we do with our token other than staking and governance, and
Right.
that's about it. In most cases, at least in my field, which it brings up another hype or buzzword, if you will, which is governance.
Hmm.
And I think once again, why does governance matter? Governance definitely does matter, but it goes back to that like who should be governing, who shouldn't be governing, do we need DAOs? In certain cases, yes. In other cases, no. The question to me that's more interesting there, though, is who actually cares about governance? Now, what I mean by that, in a gaming way is if I'm playing World of Warcraft or Madden, I probably don't care as much about like acting as a developer or like pretending like I'm on like have a board seat at like the company or that I even have like the expertise to like know how to make changes to that game. I probably
Mhm.
just care about playing the game. So once again, I'm not saying governance is unnecessary. I just question like who actually deeply cares about governance in an authentic or good faith kind of way. Um, but yeah, to your original question, most of the time I don't think staking matters. I think it's just something that's been validated, and people go, "What do we do with our tokens?" And they go, "Well, all these other guys staked it, so let's go ahead and stake it." And that's like sort of like maybe the dirty truth. I don't know.
Ye- Okay, so it's interesting, and like in many cases, it's kind of like the answer I was always looking for, because I still like, because it was always like, well, it takes it out of circulation. I'm like, okay, so like, why does that matter? Um, but
Won't
okay,
go
so like
up.
and in DeFi, I get the concept of it because it's just basically like it's lending and borrowing and rehypothecation, but it only matters in DeFi even if you can like repurpose those assets, right? Like if I'm staking, a token, and like that I understand the concept of like rewards and paying out percentages of revenue, and maybe you do that in a native token and build up the treasury, and the native token has ownership over the treasury. Like that makes sense to me. But just like literally taking a token out of circulation, staking it, and then getting paid. I guess it partially depends what you're getting paid with and what the goals are.
Yeah,
But if you're
yeah.
getting paid with like a wrapped version of the same token, then it just like it doesn't do anything. Like there's no true long-term economic benefit, right?
I agree. But long term, what about short to mid term?
So,
You know what I mean?
but you can't have it
I
both ways, right? You
I
can't you
know.
can't say, well, like we're early stages, think of where we'll be in 10 years, but then worry so much about the short term,
Do you
you know?
know? Check this out though. This goes back to my like tool argument. Staking is just a tool. Use it correctly. Like governance is a tool. Use it correctly.
Mhm.
All these things are tools, and I think a lot of times like people just haven't spent enough time contemplating or like thinking about the mechanics or how these things actually work, and they go, hey, check it out, bored apes did mutants, all right, we need to have a derivative of our apes because that's been validated and that's been proven. Wolf game, that's cool, that worked. And then it's just a lot of copying and not a lot of innovation, which
Mhm.
is awesome because we are seeing things be validated and models seep into the zeitgeist, super important. But with like staking, it's like, let me just like throw out a couple crazy ways that staking could actually be cool. What if in your game you stake a token and it emits a different token, like your game token? Or what if you as a guild take AXS and stake it inside of a guild contract, and now you have a native guild currency that you can distribute to your players in your guild for them to run around in the world with? What if you take a token and stake it into a factory, and now you're producing certain kinds of NFTs within that game? Like that's a cool mechanic rather than taking token, locking it, and then like having it become an inflationary thing for a, like, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of cool things you could do with staking, but before you like apply staking to any sort of model or project, and this is my approach to designing things, it's like you have to understand your project and your
Mhm.
game and your thing first to go, okay, now what tools do we need to like make this more interesting or execute upon it or make it more novel, right? So yeah, hopefully we'll see that start to happen more.
Yeah, and I mean, there are some elements that I guess make sense, right? Say you're in an ecosystem that, and this could be to gaming or anything else. But I think it works very very cleanly in an NFT type environment where there's NFT assets like collectible assets, right? And the entity wants to issue a native token to use within their ecosystem, right? You have to somehow get that native token out there, right? And you can sell it, I guess, but then that brings up all sorts of regulatory issues and like how
Sure.
do you price it and like it's kind of like a chicken or egg thing. Or you can release it to early adopters, and how do you do that? By having them stake the assets and basically earn a yield on it that they can then use that, and then they just start to disseminate that token. But it has to be done in a way that, like, it can't be done into perpetuity, just inflate everything, because eventually, like, the buck has to stop somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So yeah, it's that's actually really really helpful. So yeah, good, because I just can't stand it. It's always just like, well, because it's like, well, why? And it's like, well,
Yeah.
because it's this. Well, but why? I feel like I'm a 4-year-old kid, just and I never get like an answer I'm satisfied with.
Oh, dude, it confuses me in most cases too.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, with like Delphi, like my position with what I do, most of the time I'm trying to convince people not to have tokens or not to do things, and trying to explain to them why. Um, you like usually, and this is why we like to get involved early as Delphi at like an early stage. It's not because like we have more upsides, so we can actually roll up our sleeves, and so
For
that we don't
sure.
come in at a Series A and be like, oh my god, the house is on fire.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, so yeah, no, and I think maybe what lies at the heart of this is, and this is gonna sound so cheesy and stupid and obvious, is like education, right? It's like it's actually really hard to self-educate yourself inside of this world, especially when it comes to gaming and NFTs and this thing. Like I know a lot of really, really smart Web3 people in this space, and they're like, dude, gaming doesn't make any sense to me, and I have no idea where to start. It's like,
Mm,
frankly, I wouldn't either unless like I hadn't been like a really nerdy kid with like nerdy friends, and you know what I mean?
sure.
And I think that's what lies at the heart of it a lot is like we don't have a great education system in place for these things yet. So when we see things get validated in public, those become our points of contact for education and learning because they're the only things publicly out there. And unless you're actually behind the scenes seeing all the different ideas and things flying around, frankly, I have no idea how I would educate myself like super deeply. So it's a tough one, man. I think, but I do think that's what lies at the heart of a lot of the things we're
Yeah.
actually talking about, and which is why
Yeah.
we're doing a podcast.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And like, it comes back to, trusted sources and
Yeah.
ulterior motives. I mean, we are just so early in kind of the grand scheme of where all of this is going. So, yeah, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed talking to you, and would love to have you on again in the future and dive deeper into some of this stuff.
Can I?
And even just to get check-ins and see how we're going.
Oh, dude, I'll tell you what. I'll leave you with one last seed for to stew on a little bit, and maybe this could be something to check on in the future, right? And that is, and I think this lies at the heart of a lot of the things we touched upon in this conversation today, is in Web3, we have, I would argue, almost only financial tools and financial infrastructure. What I am super bullish on and excited to see is what sort of social tools and what sort of social incentives and social infrastructures we build next because we need that social yin to the financial yang of Web3. And I think that's going to be one of the things that really kicks off the next bull market and the next wave of innovation. So, really excited to see what social things come down the line in the future. And maybe
That's a
in
good
a year
plug.
or two, we could check in on them
Yeah.
and say, hey, we're there. But we'll see. But really appreciate the time and the conversation as well. It was a lot of fun. And apologies to any of the listeners if we went too into the deeps and
Oh,
too abstract.
I think this was great. I mean, usually if I can learn a few things, I think the listeners all do as well. So this was great. I appreciate it, and yeah, we'll talk again soon. Thanks, John.
Cheers.